Just sort of read Great Controversy 268, paragraph 3. When they shall have finished their testimony, quoting from Revelation 11, Alan White's going to insert a phrase here that isn't in the Bible. So in Revelation chapter 11, verse 7, the passage that we read, and when they shall have finished their testimony, Alan White's going to change that phrase and say it's not finished. It wasn't translated well in the King James, which is going to change it to finishing. I want us to pick that point up, that she says here, before 1798, in this history here, where these two witnesses are finishing their testimony, which is why I mark this arrow here just before the time of the end, something's going to happen. When they are finishing their testimony, the period when the two witnesses were to prophesy clothed in sackcloth ended in 1798. As they were approaching the termination of their work in obscurity, as they were approaching 1798, war was to be made upon them by the power represented as the beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit. So there's a power that is this beast of the bottomless pit. It's going to rise up in the period or the history just before 1798 when they're finishing their work. In many of the nations of Europe, the powers that had ruled in church and state had for centuries been controlled by Satan through the medium of the papacy. So here she's going to clearly tell us what we've already been studying, this history here. In Europe, for centuries, the papacy had had a vice-like grip upon both the churches, the other denominations, and the state. I'll read that again. In many of the nations of Europe, the powers that ruled in church and state had for centuries been controlled by Satan through the medium of the papacy. But here is brought to view a new manifestation of satanic power. So this new manifestation of satanic power is going to do what? It's going to make war upon these two witnesses or upon the saints of God. So for over 1,000 years, who's been fighting or warring or treading down the saints? The papacy. But now there's a new manifestation of satanic power that's going to do the same work. And this new manifestation of satanic power springs up just before 1798. We understand this to be France. But we use the phrase atheistic France. I don't know if you've heard that phrase used before. They don't just say it's France, we say atheistic France. Why do we say atheistic France? Sorry? Yes, it does, but I'm asking why. Because here it's what? It's new. So France that's going to rise up now is not the same France that it was before. It's a new France, not old France. Because old France was what, according to this definition? Faithful. Faithful to what? To? Not to the Bible gospel, to the mother church, to the papacy. So I read it again. In many of the nations of Europe, in parenthesis, including France, the powers that ruled in church and state in France had for centuries, for the 1260, be controlled by Satan through the medium of the papacy. So the papacy had controlled France, and the old France, I understand why you said it was the original gospel, because you've gone back pre-538. So the original France in this history here was controlled and dominated and run by the papacy. It was a papal state. But now there's going to be a new manifestation of satanic power, a new manifestation of France. It's no longer going to be a papal state. It's going to be a different type of a state, identified by Sodom and Egypt. And Ellen White's going to do all the hard work for us if we went through her study on this subject. It's chapter 15, the Bible and the French Revolution. She's going to identify two things about France. It's Sodom and Egypt. And what is Egypt identifying? Why would she mention Egypt? Who is God? Pharaoh thinks he's God, and even though he's surrounded with the Hebrews for centuries, and he's heard about their God, he knows all about their God, he says, who is God? It's not that there's a lack of information, it's a rebellious act to say that there is no God, in fact, his God. So it's this symbol of Egypt is identifying atheism or no God. I don't know if that's how you spell atheism. So Egypt is identifying atheism. And what's Sodom identifying? Okay, so we could put licentiousness. And what's being identified by Sodom is not only licentiousness, but it's the whole issue about vice and everything that's connected to it. And perhaps one of the key markers that you might identify with Sodom when we bring it into Egypt now, sorry, not Egypt, into France, is that they do away with religious customs, if I can put it that way. Maybe not even religious laws, but they're now going to enact law that undermines religious values. So everything becomes secularized. So through state legislation, they're going to now enforce a system where you can't have any religious threads or religious elements. That's Sodom. This is Sodom. So two simple examples. For centuries, the whole world has been running on a 7-day cycle. Yeah? I say centuries, I mean since the very beginning, but especially in this history here, it's a 7-day cycle. Even though they want to transition from Sabbath to Sunday, it's still run on a 7-day cycle. But France are going to rip all of that up, and they're going to switch to a metric system. If I can use that phrase, metric system. They're going to switch to a 10-day cycle. They tried that for a while, and it doesn't really work, so they ended up switching back to 7. But it's a direct attack upon the religion of God. So that's one issue. And the second issue that they really make an attack on is the subject of marriage. So marriage was what? What has it always been? It's an institution where two people come together under what? Under God. Yeah? Under his auspices or his benediction. And they say no. You can get married under the auspices of the state, and God comes out of the picture. So Ellen White will tell you more about this issue about Sodom and Egypt, but they're the two things. So I'm going to put here, if we take atheism is that there is no God, so I'm going to put Sodom as a rejection of religion, or what we might call licentiousness. So I don't want us to think that licentiousness means all they're doing is reveling and having parties. I don't think that's what is being identified there, although there is a component of that. They're coming out of the Great Depression, and things are going to get really good under Napoleon, and it's going to become a world superpower. So we know that the crime of Sodom is lots of free time and lots of food, because they have a lot of wealth, and France is about to become extremely rich and powerful. So when you get here to the end of the world, the papal world, in 1798, the King of the South is going to be resurrected. And once it resurrects, it's going to continue to do what it's always done, which is what? In this story. They're going to fight against the King of the North. So once the King of the South comes, this struggle between the North and the South just continues where it left off, way back here in history. But now it's different players. Now the King of the South is France, and the King of the North is not the Syrians. It's not even pagan Rome. It's jumped all through that, and now it's the papacy. So now there's this struggle between France and the papacy. So that's what the connection is in Daniel 11, verse 40, with connection to the history that's preceding it, all of this history that we're spoken of here, how the King of the South resurrects, and the story that we've just developed here. I'm not going to develop this any further, but the reason why I spent some time looking at this is because you have to remember that all of this is going to have an end-time application. And often we don't take enough time, don't look at in enough detail to see what the original history looked like to make a correct application at the end of the world. So sometimes we're a bit hazy. You know, in our message we know that the warfare is about the relationship with the United States and the papacy. You know, we picked that up during the presidency of Ronald Reagan, and how at the end of the world the United States it's going to do its thing with the papacy. But I want us to see how we can make those applications that we're presently making and what they're based upon. They're based upon a careful reading of history that's looked through eyes or prophetic glasses, because we're not just looking at the history. This is all secular history that I've just explained, but we need to look at it through, as I say, prophetic glasses with a specific purpose to understand what's going on. Because otherwise you could run through this history and miss the whole story. Because we know France rises up and we know Napoleon does his work, but I want us to understand why he's doing that work. What is the purpose of that? And the purpose is when you see the story about the King of the North and the King of the South. So that's why I spent some time trying to identify and look at what's going on here. Hopefully that makes a bit of sense. So in 1798, we'll go back to the verse. It says, and at the time of the end, in 1798, the King of the South, atheistic France, shall push at him. I'm sure we've all read Daniel and Revelation, or if you haven't read it, you're familiar with it. Now, the book Daniel and Revelation is a good book. It's got a lot of historical information. And before the internet, I think the average Adventist, the average amateur historian would have been hard-pressed to understand Old Testament history without his book. He did a really good job of collating a lot of history, especially when it comes to Daniel 11. But today we can replicate most of that work. You know, the average person can, just by going on to Google. And I think one thing that we have seen, if you've taken the time to do that, is that Uriah Smith's understanding of history was fundamentally correct. So I want us to understand the way he approaches history. All through the verses of Daniel 11, he says there was this battle and that battle. He is 99.5% correct. There's only a small few details that he missed, and some of them really weren't his fault because they're not that easy. They're problematic. But then he comes to a place where he makes a real mistake, a serious mistake. And that's when you get to Daniel 11 verse 40 and onwards. And what he ends up doing is not even following his own rules. He starts developing a theology which is basically literalism. Now, you know, we could think about him as a human being and think, you know, any of us could do that. But it doesn't happen in a vacuum, and I presume most of us are familiar to some degree with the story, that he already receives many warnings from whom? From James White. James White is already warning him when he begins to make his assertions about his understanding of these verses that he's making a mistake. and he doesn't listen. So anyway, he writes Daniel in Revelation. And what I'm talking about specifically is the word him. So the word him is obviously a pronoun. If you want to know what him is, in verse 40, what you need to do is you need to go back into the previous verses to find out who that him was. So without knowing about any of this, if you follow through with the theme that I've suggested, that the whole of Daniel 11 is predicated upon, who would the him be? Without looking at the verses, you can just close your Bible, just based upon the theme that we've said. King of the North, because that's what the theme of Daniel 11 is all based upon. The fight between two different dynasties or empires or kingdoms. King of the North, King of the South. It runs through that all the way through, almost without missing a heartbeat. But he's going to go and take that hymn, and he's going to go back to verse 39, 38, 37, 36, 35. He's going to go all the way back, and he's going to end up in what verse? He'd end up in verse 36. Because in verse 36 it says, and the king shall do according to his will. Now, if you run back further when it says the king in verse 36 and start going back, what you'll find is that the king that's identified here in verse 36 is the king of the north. We've identified that in 31 BC, the king of the south is taken out, which is Greece. Pagan Rome has already obtained the title of the king of the north. It decimates Egypt, the Battle of Actium. The king of the south goes out of history. It transitions from pagan Rome to papal Rome. Papal Rome becomes the king of the north. And from around verse 30, especially into verse 31, you're seeing the transition from pagan Rome to papal Rome. And by the time you get to verse 32, we're in the history of papacy, papal Rome. And if you were to read verse 32 all the way down to verse 39, all that I'm suggesting is the history of the papacy. So in verse 36, when it says, and the king, this is the papal king, the king of the north. If you were to do that, you'll get to verse 40 and everything would be nice and tidy. But Uriah Smith doesn't want to see things that way, because from verse 36 to verse 39, he wants to understand that history in a different way. He reads it and he can't see what power this is. He can't identify it as the papacy. So what he does in verse 36, when it says, the king, he makes a fatal mistake, and he changes the definite article, the king, into something that's non-definite, and he's going to change it into a king. If you see his commentary, it runs something like this. If we could change the the into an a, we would be able to explain and understand verse 40. Is that really bad to do? I want to be gentle with him. I think perhaps we're being too harsh, because we do that all the time. Often, I've seen people, I'm sure you have seen people, get a verse and change it. Or a word in a verse. I'll give you one example, which I don't want to get into hot water over. And let's go to verse 45. And he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas. What's the next word? What do we always say? And. So we change the word in to and the glorious holy mountain. And the reason we do that is what? What's the reason we do that? Because we can't conceptualize, because we've got a philosophical model that cannot conceptualize how in could work. Because in our mind's eye, we've got a picture of end time prophecy, and the word in doesn't fit into that. So what we do is we just change the word in and say, we'll make it into an and. Maybe we'll go into the Hebrew and say it could be in or and, we'll pick a word. But that's exactly what he's doing. And we turn him into a criminal, like most of you just did. And the one in verse 45 is just one example. There are others that we go in and change some things. I'll give you another one. Verse 24. We read verse 24 earlier. Even for a time, if you remember that. And I'll read the verse, but I'll tell you which point I want to pick up. He shall enter peaceably even upon the fattest places of the province, and he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey and spoil the riches. So this is the point I want to get to after the colon. Yea, he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time. Now, a plain reading of that would say what? I am attacking the strongholds. Yes? He shall forecast his devices against the strongholds. So what we do is we say actually the word against doesn't mean against, it means something totally different. In fact, it means the word from. And so we're going to substitute the words around because from is a much better application in that situation. So Uriah Smith isn't the only person who does word substitutions. I don't know how else to express it. But yes, you know, it was a bad show on his part to change the word the king to a king, and he doesn't really have a contextual license to do that, I don't think. Sorry? Okay, but I'm going to say in verse 24, if I could change the word against into from and give you some logic to it, if I could do that, it would read a lot better. It would make sense. So maybe just that's his humble way of saying that, you know, I might say, in my opinion, it means this, or let me offer you my thoughts.
Is there any record of an ever for any name?
The only logic, as far as I'm aware, is from verse 36 to verse 39. He's going to explain that this does not fit in with the characteristics of the papacy, but France. And his punchline logic is, what does France do in the year 1798? It goes to Egypt. Literally. I don't know if you all know that. Yeah? And then from Egypt, it springboards into a warfare with whom? Turkey. So if we know that, and Turkey's a skip and a hop from Syria, and Syria is the king of the north, so he has a quite tidy explanation and understanding of what's going on, but it's all based on literalism. And he acknowledges, you get from verse 40, you can kind of crawl into verse 41, because you can do that, can't you? If you're going to have a literal understanding of those verses, because verse 41 says what? The glorious land. And what's the glorious land? What's the glorious land? Cold Syria, Israel, sorry. He can get all that to work, and then it starts getting problematic. He can get into verse 42, but after that it just goes belly up. It all goes wrong. So his problem is the way he approaches Scripture, that he makes it all literal, and you know, we get all of those problems. So I will offer you a different way of approaching verse 40. This is where he makes his mistake. So it says that the king of the south is going to fight against him, and then what? And the king of the north shall come against him. So now we've got the king of the north. So Uriah Smith's understanding is, how many people did you have? You have 3 people. You have a him, king of the south, and the king of the north. Can you see that in the verse? Yeah? So he's going to make this Egypt. He's going to make this Turkey. And he's going to make this whom? France. Turkey. And he's got some, he's got some logic to identify this. Is Turkey still around? Yeah? Is Turkey still an influential player in end-time prophecy? Yeah? It's still the Ottoman Empire's there. It's falling, it's collapsing. There's a lot of reasons to understand this. Egypt. Is Egypt involved in end-time prophecy here in this story? Literally. Yes? Why? Because they help France. I'm talking about prophetically. No. I mean, this is literal Turkey, Ottoman Empire. This is literal Egypt. So let's skip over. This year is what? 1798. Let's drop down 42 years. It'll take us to the year 1840. If we skip back 2 years, 1838 to 39, what's going on? In the world, in Europe, the nations are getting frustrated. First of all, they're getting really scared. What are they scared about? Egypt and Turkey. Yes? There's a fear that's going on. And what is the fear? What is the concern that angers them? Or radical Islam, which is whom in that history? Sorry? No, it's not the Ottoman Empire. It's not the Ottoman Turks. Sometimes we have a misunderstanding of that. In that history, radical Islam, the Wahhabis and those people who follow them, is actually Egypt. Egypt has become radicalized, and it wants to do what? He's not really worried about the Ottoman Empire. These want to form a caliphate, and a caliphate's end objective is to do what? Take over the world. So the world is what? Europe. How do you take over Europe if you live in North Africa? You have to go through the gateway. The gateway is the Bosphorus Straits. You cannot do a naval assault and hope to bring down the world or Europe. Not only that, if you go through Turkey, I don't know what the population of Turkey is, but you've got a ready-made army there. Once you subjugate them, you're all of the same religion, you just radicalize Turkey as you go along, and not only have you got a gateway into Europe, you've also, I'll say like doubled your army, if I can express it that way. So they've got a strategy. They want to bring down Turkey, not only because they see that Turkey has become weak in their religion, in their worldview of who and what they are, but it's a stepping stone for the caliphate to begin to take over the world. So the dynamics that are happening here in 1798, we want to understand this is the time of the end, and we're going to make an end-time application of all of this history. That's why we need to be really careful to understand what's going on in this history. So you've got all of this understanding, and Uriah Smith takes it literally, remember, and he wasn't that far off about what's going on. There are these three protagonists. He's identified it as France, but we identify it as Europe, don't we? When we make an application of 1840, we say there's Europe, and Europe is controlling or brokering a deal between Egypt and Turkey. The four Christian or European powers, the four European powers. Yeah? One thing that we've missed for a long time, it's straight in the writings of the Spirit Prophecy, it says the four European powers. And even if you don't know who they all four are, one of them was Russia. We know one of them was Russia. And that's something that we've missed in end-time application, that Russia is the European power. Did we already know that? We certainly did, because right here it says the Huns, the top toe on the 1843 chart, are the Huns. And the Huns, if you trace back their history, are the Russians. So it's been on the chart for a long time until it got obliterated out of the hearts and minds of God's people. And they became whom? Who did they come? The Alemanni. We heard of that? That group? The Alemanni. Do you know who obliterated the Huns out of our consciousness? It's Jones. The man that God had set up to bring a reformation into our church. He's the one who took out or buried the truth about Russia that we need to dig out again. There's more things about A.T. Jones than meets the eye. Okay, so Uriah's misunderstanding, although it's wrong, he's onto something. Because the argument that he's going to use, in a literal, we're going to do what? Use exactly the same argument, but symbolically at the end of the world. So it's well worth your reading about what's going on in this history. By the way, I've got 1840. What is the date that we use here? August the 11th. Now, even though they broker a priest, there's still going to be guns that are fired. There's still going to be some kind of battle or interaction. Do you know when that happens? September the 11th, 1840. So you've got 9/11 in that story. And if you were going to mark how the world would view that history, they'd mark September the 11th as the date, not August the 11th. So something I want us to understand, when we're dealing with end-time prophecy and we're making applications, when the Bible gives a date or an event, people say, that's not the date or that's not the event. We should already know that what the Bible identifies as the key date is, I don't want to say even is true history, because both of these are true histories, but the Bible wants to make a specific point about a specific event for a specific reason. And just because we don't see what that reason is, doesn't mean the Bible's made a mistake. The Bible says, I want you, if you can personify the Bible, to look at this event for a specific reason. Even though the world is telling you, actually look at this event as a date. And there could be two separate dates, and they normally are.
Like it says in Daniel, what is noted in the scriptures.
Amen. Yes. Okay, so Uriah Smith made this mistake, but he can still teach us a lot, because we're going to use his literal understanding to make a prophetic or symbolic application. So all is not lost. If you go back to verse 40, can you see there's a colon after the word him? Yes?
Yes.
Now, are we all familiar with a rule that we can find in the Bible, which is called repeat and enlarge? Yeah? So I'm going to employ that principle in this verse, a repeat and enlargement. And normally when we do repeat and enlarge, we say there's verse 1 here and verse 7 over here, different books, and we'd say verse 7 is a repeat of verse 1 and it enlarges upon it. And I think we're all familiar with doing that. We call it proof texting. But what we tend not to do, maybe because of we're not used to it, maybe laziness, is in verse 1, there is often a repeat and enlarge in the verse itself. And sometimes we don't look out for those things. But if we saw it, the verse would interpret itself. Does that make sense? Yeah? So if that makes sense to you, keep your finger in here. Let's go through an example to see how we would approach this verse. So one of the famous verses that we use in our movement is Isaiah chapter 46. Isaiah chapter 46, and what's the famous verse that we pick out from here? Do we know? Sorry? Verse 10. So I've given you a clue. Verse 10. I'll read it out. Declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times of things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. I want to suggest there's two repeating enlargements in this verse. Can anybody see it? We'll do the first one. End. Let me read it so I don't make a mistake. Declaring the end from the beginning. So we've got the end from the beginning. So that's the first statement. And then it's going to repeat and enlarge upon it. So we've got what? Ancient times. So we've got ancient times and not yet. So I'm suggesting this phrase here is repeating and enlarging this phrase here. Because if I were to ask you, declaring the end from the beginning, if I were to ask you, where do you begin the beginning? Where would you mark the beginning? Okay, so you can see it now, but maybe if we've taken time and worked through it, maybe we wouldn't have seen it. So I've got a repeat and enlargement. What else have I got? Because where did it start? It starts with the end, which would be the omega, and then it goes to the alpha. Yes? Okay, it says the end to the beginning. But what's this one saying? The beginning and then the end. So we've not only have we got repeat and enlarge, but as my sister says, we've also got a chiasm. And a chiasm is just a fancy word for saying mirror. Does that make sense? Could we see how this would be a mirror? Yeah? Yes. So you've got a piece of paper that you fold in the middle, and we'd say alpha and omega, and we did that in wet ink. If you closed the book and then opened it again, or the piece of paper, what would you get? You'd get the opposite. You'd get something that looks like that. You'd get an alpha and omega. That is what a chiasm is, or mirroring. Yeah, that's kindergarten maths. That's what we do, or grade 1 maths. So that's what's being identified here. It's repeating, but it's also doing it in a mirrored or a chiastic structure. The Bible does this in many places, and if you can become familiar when you see this, it helps you to understand how to approach difficult verses. Now, this is only a verse which is only 4 lines in my Bible, depending on how big your font is. But there's another one that comes up. It says, same verse, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do my pleasure. So if I were to ask you, what does counsel mean? So before I did that, if I were to ask you, what does counsel mean? Everybody here would give me all these different versions, their understanding of what it means. They'd go to a dictionary, they'd go to another verse, they'd say counsel means the will of God, maybe the 10 Commandments, and I would have said, no. Counsel means none of those things. You need to let the Bible interpret itself, and the first place you should allow the Bible to do that is in its immediate context. And its immediate context, I would suggest, would be the verse itself. This is one of Millie Miller's, I think, most important rules, I would suggest, which is let every word have its proper bearing, have its place, and not just have its place in the Bible, but in the verse itself, in the sentence that you're reading. And often we don't do that. So now we're going to define what? Counsel equals pleasure. So depending on how we want to get dictionary definitions of these things, counsel sounds like some kind of law or something, but pleasure sounds like a whim. I just feel like doing it. I'll just do my pleasure. So when we start putting words connected together in this way, it helps to define and mold our thinking about, just as an example on this one, which is a trivial example perhaps, if I said, what is God's pleasure? it's now being controlled in a much more defined way than just God woke up one day and said, I think we'll do it this way because I enjoy doing it, which is how we define pleasure. Yeah? Okay, so I think it's a really powerful technique for us to begin to explore when we're doing our own Bible study. And once you can see it in a few places, what you should do is, I recommend when we have class, is that if you see a verse, not only spend a lot of time looking at the verse, but the first thing to do is see if there's a repeat and enlarge or some kind of structure or pattern to the verse. It doesn't happen all the time. It might happen about 10% of the time. I don't know what percentage it is. But if you can find it, the verse just opens up to you in a really powerful and profound way that makes it easy to understand what's going on. And without that, it's hard going. You have to rely upon a computer or a concordance. You have to rely upon history. You have to rely upon a lot of symbology and go in lots of different places if you don't employ this rule. But if you did, the verse just unravels to you, I think, in a really beautiful and profound way. So I don't know about you, but this is pretty benign. You think, well, what's the big deal about that? But I think in its structure, it's really beautiful. The verse itself defines everything that you need to know about what end means, what beginning means, what ancient means, and what not yet means. Because if I said not yet, what does that mean? Simply, if I said not yet, it means not now, it means sometime. So I've already introduced this idea. If you look for a dictionary definition, it's sometime in the future. But is that a biblical definition of not yet? Sorry? Let's use the verse. In the verse, is that a biblical definition of what not yet means? Because what does not yet mean? It means end. It's not some kind of nebulous idea of tomorrow or the next day, sometime in the future. It has a specific definition. Not yet means the end. So if you're to understand that, and then you can get over the grammatical problems of going from Hebrew to Greek, all foolishness, obviously. Now you go to Revelation 17, and it talks about the beast that was, not the beast, we'll go to, no, let me just make sure I do that right. Yes, just to make sure I get the words right. I think it's 17:8. I think, is it? We'll go with 8. The beast that thou sawest was, is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit. And which verse did you want to go to? Which one? But tell me the verse you wanted. 11. The beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th. So verse 8 will do it, verse 11 will do it. If you go to the back end of verse 8, did I say something wrong?
No, you said nothing wrong. That's what she woke up in her head this morning, that the 8th is of the 7th.
Oh. When they beheld, you have to share that with us later. When they behold the beast that was and is not and yet is. So when it says not yet, I'm saying is the same phraseology or concept of yet is in the future. So what Revelation 17 is teaching us, when it talks about the future as in the phrase yet is, it's not talking about just any time in the future. It's talking about the end. It's a very specific term. So that's all I want us to pick up, because if we were just to look at what yet not is, even if we went into the Hebrew, it wouldn't help us. It wouldn't be a biblical definition of what that means. So now we could go there and we can say, counsel is my pleasure, and we can say that not yet or yet is, which is the same way of expressing this thought, is talking about the end. So it's a specific point in time, specific history that's going on. So I want to recommend to you approaching not only the Bible, even the Spirit of Prophecy, with this critical eye. Why have I spent all of that time going to Isaiah 46, verse 10? It was to show off to you that I could do chiastic structures, obviously. Hopefully not. It was to go to Daniel 11, verse 40. So what am I suggesting that we're going to see in Daniel 11, verse 40? We're going to see a chiastic structure. And we're going to see the chiastic structure there. And if you can approach this verse this way, you can skip over all the history classes. You don't need to know anything about all of that stuff that we've taught, about how history works, about who is who. It's all going to make it really clear. Now, when you want to make an application, then you can go, and you will have to go to history, but the verse itself will define everything for you. So we can see a colon there, hopefully, after the word him. Can we see that? So this is how we're going to structure the verse. There's a portion of the verse here at the beginning which says, I just want to make sure how we approach it now, because I'm not going to just do it all for you. What would go in that box? At the time of the end. So at the time of the end, what happens? The king of the south is going to do something against him. Here's the mirror, the line of reflection. And you'll see, as we read through, I think you can all probably begin to see it, that you can begin to see this reflection. Then what happens? The king of the north is going to do what? Come against him. With chariots and horsemen and many ships. So if you can structure the verse this way, time of the end, this is going to happen, and then this is going to happen using this power. You can see that the Bible defines itself, that the him is the king of the north, and the king of the south is him. And all of this is happening when? At the time of the end. So at the time of the end, this is happening, and this is happening. Does that make sense, my brother? Someone said?
Say that again, I'm taking that in.
Oh, I'm saying at the time of the end, this happens, the king of the south comes against him, and at the time of the end, the king of the north comes against him. So the hymns is the king of the north, and this hymn is the king of the south. Now, if you approach this verse the way Uriah Smith approaches it, or if you had done proof texting, if I had said him, if I had said Sabbath in one verse, and Sabbath in another verse, the word Sabbath would have controlled and defined how we're going to approach the problem. So we would have said verse 1 and verse X is the same verse because they're connected by what word? Sabbath. And what have you assumed? They're the same thing. Yeah? Because the Sabbath and the Sabbath are the same thing. Now if you had done that with verse 40, you have got him and him. It's the same word. So if you're going to follow that rule, then the him would have had to be the same person. And this is what Uriah Smith's problem is. That he approaches the verse in a way that's, I wouldn't say wrong, but it's problematic. Sorry? Yes. Why wouldn't you assume it's the same? Why wouldn't you? I mean, we approached... Sorry?
Because of the structure of the language.
Exactly. The structure of the language, you'd assume it's the same thing.
No, but I'm saying, you said, why wouldn't he assume it? I'm saying because of the structure of the language, you shouldn't assume that it's the same person.
So if you're not going to assume it's the same person, how would you approach the verse? It's very difficult once you've got the answer. People ask why do I spend ages going through excruciating pain before giving the answer to people. And the reason is this: once you have the answer, it's extremely difficult to go back and check how you developed and got that answer. So if I were to ask you, if we've got a clean sheet of paper and we approach verse 40, how would you approach that verse and develop it? And most of us have approached it with a historical understanding, with all the protagonists in this verse already put into place. And because we haven't done it through first principles, it's not that straightforward to do it. Because if we were to go through it now, I think we'd struggle to say, if the king of the south pushes against him, and we could say that was 1798, how do we know what the rest of the verse is? How do we know that the king of the north is going to push against him, and what does that mean? And what you're forced to do is to essentially go back into history, pluck up a date, which is 1989, develop a logic that says you're going to go from France to Russia, and then you build up and construct this verse that way. And many people won't believe that or buy into it, because it's a construction that we've placed using... I agree it's sound logic. I'm not trying to say it's even the wrong way of doing it, but it's a convoluted way, and it's not that straightforward. It's not intuitive, I would suggest. It's hard to do it that way, but we did it that way. But I'm saying if we approached it using William Miller's rules, the Bible really does interpret itself. And then when we now go and plug in all the symbols, everything works out really tidily and simply.
I would just say, too, that from their perspective back then, without the progression of history going on further, there's nothing in the verse that would suggest to them that there's a timeline.
Yes.
He was trying to figure it all as something that's right back to back.
Yeah. So, the verse is structured in a really profound and beautiful way, I think. And one of the things that it really teaches you is this, that there are two things happening at the time of the end. And our interpretation of what this verse means, that we say it's two dates, isn't just some invention that we've made up. The verse teaches it. The verse teaches that two things happen at the time of the end. And I want to be specific because it says at, not during. The reason why that's important to understand is because most of the time when Ellen White talks about the time of the end, she talks about it as this period of time. She says, we are in the time of the end, not we're at the time of the end. And opponents who war against our message say, you know what this is teaching? Because many people in the church accept the events of 1989. I mean, it's world history, it's earth-shattering. Everybody knew the papacy was involved in that. Because the papacy is involved, it must be connected to end-time prophecy, mustn't it? Yeah? But the way our church understands it is like this. Let me just ask a point. I just said the way our church understands it. Is that a correct phrase?
No.
If I said our church. Sorry?
Church is a group of individuals, no matter where they are or where they go.
Okay. And change it to the? If I say the, it's a definite article. Can I change it to there? Put ownership with the problem and give it to them. Because we're not part of the problem, are we? Sorry?
Yeah, we should include ourselves.
We should? Oh, so you like that one? Okay. I prefer this one. It's not our church, it's theirs.
About the corporate church.
Corporate church, corporate church. I don't know if this is a fellowship or like a ministry. I don't know how you classify. Like I thought this was the group that was in rescue.
Yeah.
So is this a corporate
No.
structure? It's not.
No.
It has all the characteristics of it. So
Stand and pray for all of you.
I've got 5 minutes and I've lost my point here. Where were we? Why did I do this?
The church.
The
go back
church,
to
the
our
church accounts the
Oh yes. So here you've got 1798. Everyone's okay with that because that's verse 40. And then it says, at the time of the end this happened, and the church is going to subtly change it to say at, and I'm going to say during or in the time of the end, then what's going to happen? 1989. Yeah, it's sometime, and I'll put sometime. Sometime in or during the time of the end, this is what's going to happen. And we have to develop a robust argument to say that is an inaccurate way of interpreting this verse. Sorry? So we've got to be specific. It says, at the time of the end, this happens and this happens. Not that this happens here and then sometime later another event happens. It's at and at. We really have to get to grips with this concept because without understanding verse 40, we don't have a message. So our whole faith stands upon a cauldron, my brother just said. Isn't that what he did? I don't know if you heard him just at the cauldron. That's what he said. It's all based upon the grammar and the structure about how these words are lined up and put together. So if we can see that, then what this verse teaches is this. At the time of the end, the king of the south is going to push against the king of the north, and at the time of the end, the king of the north is going to take his revenge against the king of the south. The verse is structured that way. It guides you into that concept and that idea. And once you can see that without knowing any history, without knowing who it's talking about, you can see that there's two time of the ends which deal with the same protagonist, King of the North and the King of the South, and then what you have to then do is just plug in the symbols and the numbers and everything falls into place, which is what we do. But it's predicated upon a correct understanding of how this verse is structured. Otherwise, to approach it the other way is not only problematic, it's difficult. And I think it's hard for people to swallow because they can't see that you can have the time of the end twice because Ellen White won't teach that. And once you can see that structured in this verse, then it begins to open the reform lines that we have. And then you can see the methodology that Ellen White uses and employs throughout her scriptures. She'll say something like, we're living in the time period of 1888. People are warring and struggling against what's happening. And to combat that argument, where will she take you? She'll take you to the line of Christ. And then she'll talk about the line of Christ and says, we're doing the same thing today. And there she's done a line upon line. She's taken one history and shown how it's been applied to her own history. And so once you can see that this is the way this verse is structured, it gives you the power, the tools, to go back into 3 histories. We did Egypt, we did Babylon, and we did the papacy. And we can see all of those histories are now prefiguring our own history. So let's just plug in the numbers in the last few moments that we've got. We've already done this one. The King of the South, I put an R here, remember? Resurrection of a new satanic power. This is France. France is now going to do what in 1798? Sorry? So it pushes against the papacy, but how does it do it? What's it going to do? Its activities. It's now going to make war against whom? Not against the papacy. Not just Italy. It's all of the European nations. Why does Napoleon want to take over Europe? Is it because he's a megalomaniac and he wants to be the king of the world? That's what the world would teach us to believe. Is that true? It probably is. But the Lord is going to use him, because here's Napoleon, and I'm the Lord. People like that. Okay. So what's the Lord going to do with Napoleon? He's going to smash up the cartel. Yes. So his purpose is to destroy the European nations, the kings. We'll call it the 10 kings because that's the prophetic number, even though there may be 7 of them. So he's going to destroy the 10 kings because what he wants to do is break up the party. And then at the end, he's going to... The fact that he takes the Pope to France and he dies and all that is neither here nor there. What Napoleon's role is to destroy the nations. When you destroy the nations, it delivers what? A deadly wound to the papacy. And by the fact that he begins to do that work, he separates from her. So he's the one who's separating from her, then he destroys everyone else, and he breaks up the party. So that's what's happening here, France and the papacy. We'll stop there, even though I haven't finished my thought, because I want to try and stick to time, otherwise we'll lose ourselves. Let's close with prayer. Heavenly Father, we want to thank you and praise you for your goodness and mercy. We want to ask, Lord, that you would help us to understand your word in a clearer way, that we might have confidence, not only the things that we teach are true, but individually, Lord, we may have confidence and put all of our weight upon the truths that you have taught us through your word. Help us to understand that this is indeed righteousness by faith. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.